The coronavirus outbreak raises near impossible financial choices for world leaders and everyday citizens alike. There's no economic mind better to address those questions, big and small, than Roger Ferguson. As president and CEO of TIAA, Ferguson leads a team of some 16,000 employees who oversee more than $1 trillion in assets, helping clients around the world manage their money in this uncertain moment. He's also a former vice chairman at the Fed, where he guided monetary policy in the aftermath of a different crisis, September 11th. On this episode of Influencers, Roger Ferguson joins me to talk about how the federal government has responded to the crisis so far, what will come next, and what this means for your bottom line. Hello and welcome to Influencers. I'm Andy Serwer, and welcome to our guest, Roger Ferguson, CEO of TIAA and former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Roger, great to see you.
Andy, thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Let me ask you about TIAA and how things have changed during COVID.
So you can imagine, as with all companies, things have changed in a number of ways, but some things also are unchanged. And so we started the process of moving to remote work, so-called work from home, March 3rd, March 4th, and had everyone, 16,500 employees, 99% of our employee population, all working remotely by the third week of March. And that included around the world, all of our employees. I was really particularly pleased to see the speed with which that was accomplished for such a large number of people. Again, 99% of our population, and it's worked well. A couple of things that we've seen, the use of technology has been, quite beneficial, surprisingly so. We've been able to have, small, quick meetings of a small handful of people. And at the same time, we've been able to have, virtual town halls attended by literally 10,000 people around the world, which obviously would not have been available before. We have found that our individual clients are comfortable working with us through Zoom and WebEx and other tools of that sort. And we found a very large uptake in terms of the use of technology by our individual clients. So our mobile app, we've seen an increase in log-ons by more than 60% year over year. And our mytia.org, which is our secure website, we've seen increases of use by more than 50% year over year. And so, we've managed to move smoothly into this new world, and it has proven to be, in many ways, quite beneficial in driving towards the use of new technologies. The final point I'd make is we did a quick survey of our associates, and our associate engagement is really quite high. And so, so far, so good. But I'm sure we'll have to watch it very closely going forward.
Yeah, the going forward part is challenging because it's completely unknown. And I'm curious as to what your business is telling you about where the economy is right now.
Well, look, our business is telling us that individuals started in the place of being very, very anxious. So we could see a big uptick in the number of phone calls and the nature of the questions. They were mainly looking for reassurance about their own savings and about market and market volatility. You may recall that in early March, the markets were, I would describe them almost in panic mode. And needless to say, that spilled over into how individuals are seeing things. I'd say more recently, the call volumes have started to return to normal. The kinds of questions are the ones you'd expect, but they don't seem to have that same sort of tone about them. And so that's one thing. The other thing that we've seen in our business is a pickup in flows into our core annuity product, the TIAA Traditional, which is historically has been and is shown again to be a safe haven investment. Individuals who are worried about markets, worried about uncertainty, want to take advantage of an insurance company type product we're moving money into that product at numbers that are much higher than we've had historically. That has slowed somewhat now, but still sort of higher than normal. And so those are some of the things that we've seen that indicate that the recession and the uncertainty continue to be there, but maybe slowing down just a little bit from panic to the kinds of reasonable questions you'd expect to see on a day-to-day basis.
Roger, I want to ask you the curve question, the shape of, the V, the swoosh, the U. Are we recovering nicely here? Are we going to have another dip? What are you thinking?
It seems to me that we're recovering unevenly. This morning, today we're recording this on, I think, Thursday, July 28th, the GDP numbers came out. They showed a very dramatic dip, historic change quarter over quarter in terms of GDP growth. My expectation is that we will see a uneven swoosh, if I can use that phrase. I've also occasionally thought about, sort of a sawtooth, up and down a bit before we gradually start to take off. But even as we, if it's a swoosh or the sawtooth with a gradual lift, I think that gradual lift overall is going to mask some deep unevenness. There'll be some industries that come back very, very quickly that will feel like a V in that industry, and there'll be some that recover very, very, very slowly. And so we shouldn't let the general statement about sort of a gradual lift off at the right time mask the fact that it will still feel, for some individuals and some industries, very, very slow and uneven.
I think you might have coined a new one, Roger, the sawtooth swoosh.
Yes, exactly. Right. Too many analogies, right?
Right. So let me ask you, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the Federal Reserve, which you know all kinds of things about. The Fed's been pretty aggressive. Jay Powell has pledged to keep interest rates at record lows and extend emergency support for a long time. Is this the right path?
It feels to me that it is the right path. So while we're talking about how deep the recession has been and the uncertainty about the recovery, I think had the Fed not moved aggressively, things could have been and most likely would have been much worse. Unemployment is still at very, very high levels, but it could have been worse. So I think they did the right thing. The right thing in three different ways. First, by moving their interest rates quickly down. Secondly, by communicating exactly what their intentions were. And both of those were tools that they had used before in 2007, 2008, 2009. The third thing that they did, though, was direct support to various sectors and parts of the economy, to the real economy, which was unprecedented, the Main Street facility, et cetera. I think, however, that has also proven to be quite beneficial. So I think I would give them very, very high marks. And I also give them high marks for recognizing and saying very publicly that the future is uncertain, because I think that's also a fair statement. And it's important for authorities to recognize the uncertainty when it's there and get people prepared for that.
From your experience as a former Fed official, can you shed any light on the inner workings of the Fed during a crisis like this? For instance, when you were the only Fed official in Washington during 9/11, what is that like, Roger?
These crises are both moments of real-time decision-making in periods of uncertainty and leveraging deep expertise at the Fed. Certainly 9/11 had both of those, right? A great deal of uncertainty exactly what was happening, in markets, what was happening, to the US, where we're under attack, et cetera. But the Fed has a reservoir of expertise that allows it to come through these crises quite well and guide the economy through the crises relatively well. So that expertise includes the way markets work, the ability to understand where pockets of illiquidity are popping up, where maybe the Fed can help, the ability to leverage now new communication techniques. And so the Fed is well equipped to handle crises. The other point I'd make is, the Fed learns, as would any institution, from crisis to crisis. And so, there have been a number of crises. You referred to 9/11, then obviously the 2008, 2009. Each one of those build on a legacy or create a legacy of new insight. So 9/11 was one of the first times that we aggressively expanded the Fed balance sheet to support the US economy. It was an unprecedented number, well over $1 trillion for a few days. That looks like, small stuff now when the Fed's balance sheet is, I think, probably around 8 trillion and may get, somewhat larger. We communicated clearly on 9/11 with a very short statement to be clear about what our plans and expectations were in terms of providing liquidity for the economy. 2008, 2009 used communication even more fully, and now have done it even more. And so the Fed is a learning organization building, the playbook page by page as it navigates through, one crisis after another. So I have a high degree of confidence in their ability to cushion the blows to the economy, not to eliminate them altogether. And I think they've shown their ability to do that to date.
I'm sure you know Jay Powell, and I'm curious as to what you think about the pressure that President Trump is putting on him when it comes to Twitter and whether or not it affects his decision making.
So you're right. I do know Chairman Powell. We had the pleasure of working together back in 1982, 83, when we both worked at a law firm in New York City, Davis Polk and Wardwell. So I've known him for quite a while. And indeed, we were neighbors together in Westchester County in New York for a period of time. I am sure that he is unfazed by, the pressures that are emerging from many different camps. And I would say, while, we're focused in on these pressures, we should recognize that, there have been pressures placed on the Federal Reserve by politicians for long periods of time. Lyndon Johnson tried to put some pressure on the Fed during his day. Richard Nixon tried to put pressure on the Fed during his day. So I think back to the point of the Fed being a learning organization, the leaders of the Fed recognize that it is a bit of a hot seat, and there will be pressures put on them, and they've learned from each other that the job of the Federal Reserve Chair is to withstand those pressures, to not buckle, and to do what he or she thinks is the right thing, given the mandate given to the Fed by Congress. And I'm highly confident that Chairman Powell, Jay Powell, will continue in that fine tradition.
I mentioned President Trump, and back in January, I think you said, Roger, that the market was expecting President Trump to win re-election. I'm wondering if you still believe that, and if not, what the implications of that are.
Yeah, I'm not sure today exactly what the market is thinking because there's so many pressures on the market, obviously. When I made those comments in January, the economy is in a very, very different place. We were perhaps just, I don't remember exactly when I made those comments, but it was before the COVID crisis really started to unfold in February. Right now, the markets are thinking about a number of things. Certainly, they're thinking about the depth of the recession. They're thinking about corporate earnings. They're observing the impact of low interest rates and how long that's likely to last. As I read various reports, one also sees that the market may be trying to think about the possibility that Vice President Biden becomes the next president of the United States, and trying to understand what that might mean. And I think what they'll understand, we'll all come to understand, as Vice President Biden rolls out his policy prescriptions, there will be something to focus in on and try to figure out which sectors are likely to be impacted by changing administration. But at this stage, I think there's so many pressures in the market. It's hard to say that it's taking a particular point of view, but certainly the polls suggest that this race is certainly tightening. And we'll wait till election day to see how it actually unfolds.
Right. I mean, you worked on Barack Obama's Economic Recovery Board, and I'm wondering if you came into contact with Vice President Biden and what sort of president you think he might be in terms of the economy.
To say I came in contact with him, I think, in all honesty, would be a bit of an overstatement. He certainly came to the meetings. My impression was, as others have the impression of him, a very attentive, senior, seasoned statesman. A person who's been in and around politics for a long time. I won't even begin to speculate beyond that. What I know of him is pretty much what everyone knows of him from observing him in the Senate and in the vice presidency, and then observing him during his campaign.
And switching over to wealth management a little bit, Roger, and you touched on this a little bit, but how has the pandemic influenced the way your clients are approaching managing their wealth?
It's been very interesting because once they got through the early sort of panic in the market, my observation is our clients have been maybe different from others in that they seem to be quite reassured, frankly. We've seen very, very few of them sort of change their asset allocations. Now we start with planning. We ask people to discuss their risk tolerances, and in the vast majority of cases, their risk tolerances prove to be accurate, and they have not made dramatic moves. Now, our clients are primarily focused on retirement, and even as we surveyed them, compared to the average American, they're much more comfortable about their retirement prospects. And so, because our clients tend to be long-term investors, because they start with planning and because we give them advice, they've actually, I believe, been maybe less buffeted by the volatility and ups and downs of the markets than is probably true of the average retail client.
Now, should people rebalance their 401ks now based on the pandemic? And if so, how?
My general advice is to be cautious about rebalancing based on emotion and based on short-term incoming data, which could be really quite contradictory. I believe what people should do is think about whether their risk tolerances have changed and maybe rebalance based on risk tolerance. The other thing that the average retail investor should be very careful about is much economic data and research shows that retail investors tend, unfortunately, to sort of get out of the equity markets at the low. They tend to be slow to get back into the markets and miss the rise, the rallies that inevitably follow. And so there's a danger about doing too much rebalancing in the midst of such uncertainty. Having said that, that's sort of general advice, and individuals should certainly speak to their own advisors and certainly think about their risk tolerance. And if that has changed, then perhaps a gradually professionally managed rebalancing might be the right thing to do.
Financial literacy has been a priority of yours. I'm wondering if it's still on the table now. Is it still critically important given everything else going on?
Oh, I think financial literacy is absolutely critically important given everything else that's going on. If anything, it may actually have risen in importance in a period of uncertainty, in a period of rising unemployment, in a period when some individuals are forecasting that a large number of the jobs that have disappeared may not return. Individuals have to become financially literate. And beyond the short term of the pandemic and the recession, there are also bigger long-term issues that should drive financial literacy. First, as we well know, there's the aging population that continues to be a challenge here and around the world. We understand that Social Security, which is a bedrock of financial stability for many people, may be a bit challenged going forward. And so, I think financial literacy is always relevant. Right now, other kinds of literacy, medical and health issues have come into play, but the bedrock of understanding how to manage one's finances, I think, never becomes irrelevant. And if anything, its relevance has increased given the uncertainties of the economy all around us.
Let me switch over to policy questions a little bit, Roger, and I want to ask you about the next stimulus package or just government aid generally when it comes to addressing the economic fallout from COVID-19. Congress is debating that right now. What do you think the best path forward is there?
Well, first, let me start by giving high marks to Congress and for moving aggressively on stimulus. So we've talked about the Fed and what it did. This crisis, I think, was notable by the speed with which fiscal policy came into play at large scale numbers for sure. $3 trillion, I think, total in what might, I think, are 4 separate packages. And so we should recognize that that has proven to be quite important. Getting money directly into the hands of people who need it, I think, proved to be quite important as well. Congress is now in the midst of debating the next package. I'm not one to try to advise policymakers from my seat, but I would observe that markets are probably taking a focus in on this. I would observe that the most recent numbers suggest that the recession was really quite deep, and it's not clear to me that it's over yet. I would strongly observe that even Chairman Powell and others have been urging Congress to continue to be in action. And frankly, much of this is driven by the virus, and one has to observe that there's still hot pockets of virus in and around the United States. The death toll is now over 150,000. So all that says to me that I would encourage Congress to continue to hammer out and to negotiate and to come forward with a package that is well-rounded and of a scale that actually has the desired impact. I know that the conversations between Democrats and Republicans right now are probably pretty heated. They don't need to hear from Roger Ferguson on exactly what the number should be, but I do think they need to hear that markets are expecting a stimulus of a type that continues to provide the support that the early combination of stimulus and monetary policy provided, that have again cushioned a financial system and real economy that could have been even in much worse shape.
The coronavirus has taken a disproportionate toll economically and in terms of health on people of color. And I'm wondering if you think that Congress should specifically address those populations.
I've been on a few phone calls where I think that probably does make some sense. We have to recognize the reality that the coronavirus has disproportionately affected minorities, as you say, for a variety of reasons. And thinking through the process of helping to rebuild those communities, I think is very, very important. I believe that at least some members of Congress are thinking about the possibility of doing something with community development organizations that focus in those spaces. Others I think have asked for a specific focus on HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And so I think it is important for Congress to take note of the reality around them, that this virus has disproportionately impacted people of color. I think the statistics show that African Americans make up approximately 13% of the US population, but make up something like 20% of those that have been impacted by the virus. I may have my numbers off slightly. That I think calls for national attention. And in part, it is a result of the fact that health inequities and disparities have been built into the system. It's related to wealth inequities and disparities, related to income inequities and disparities. So there's a pattern here that is playing out in these virus impacts, but that go back in the history of the country. And I do think it's important for Congress to acknowledge and take note of that. Absolutely.
Sort of moving into racial justice and social justice, Roger, the business community seemed to respond in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. But my question is it real and is it sustainable? And what's your assessment of it?
One never knows, obviously, because we've had ebbs and flows around racial issues in the United States. This one to me does feel different in a number of ways. First is indeed that the business community really has spoken out almost with a unified and singular voice. I'm not sure that was true during the civil rights era. Secondly, we're seeing both symbolic actions and what I think of as maybe the beginnings of some real actions coming out of the business community. There's, I think, an introspection and a self-reflection going on in a number of companies around, how they're treating their populations and how they embrace diversity and inclusion. We see things such as the renaming of products, which certainly didn't happen in the 60s. I think boards are beginning to also ask these questions. So my sense of it is one of cautious optimism and hope that perhaps the business community has come to recognize that it as a community and individual companies and individuals have a very important role to play in resolving this long-standing set of issues around racial inequality in America. Certainly my company wants to continue to be in the lead there. We have a long history of focus on diversity and inclusion. When I look at our board, it is over 1/3 minority, and our board now is roughly 54% female representation on the board. I think we may be the first Fortune 100 company to have a majority female board. And so we invite and we welcome others to join us in being leaders in diversity and inclusion at the corporate level.
On a personal level, Roger, what challenges did you face as a Black man at elite institutions like Harvard and the Fed, and how did you overcome those?
So I grew up in Washington, D.C. when it was a segregated city. I grew up desperately wanting to go to an amusement park in Montgomery County, Maryland, that was segregated. So instead of driving 30 minutes to get to an amusement park in the summer, we'd have to drive 2+ hours to go to Hershey Park, which was integrated. So I have a sense of what this challenge is like. That's not the same as being physically threatened by a policeman because of the color of my skin. But even now, in parts of New York City, I find it very hard to get a cab going uptown. I've been at social events with other corporate leaders at a country club. Someone invited me as a guest. And as I walked from the table, another person in the country club called me over and said, waiter, I've just dropped my spoon here. Can you pick it up and get me a new one? And so it's important for people to know that even CEOs of Fortune 80 companies face micro inequities on almost a daily basis because of race. Having said that, my philosophy has always been 2 or 3 things. First, I'm a real believer in education as a great equalizer. And so I stayed in school at my mother's request, probably longer than she expected till I was 30 years old. Because she always said to me, education is the one thing they can't take away from you. That degree is the one thing they can't deny. Secondly, I've always taken the point of view that the ignorance of someone else around race and other things is not going to undermine me as I pursued what I wanted to do. I think if I had been thrown off the path because somebody else said something stupid to me or treated me disrespectfully, they would have been the winners. And that is not where I want to go. And the third, you raised this issue of elite institutions. To be fair, I've been fortunate to be a child of the civil rights movement, to be a child of affirmative action. So when I went to Harvard, we had a very large number of African Americans, and I found the institution working really hard to figure out how to make sure that we felt welcome. At the Fed, I was the 3rd African American governor, the first person to be, first African American to be the vice chair. But I found that again to be a very collegial organization. Chairman Greenspan is just a superb observer and supporter and non-judgmental person when it comes to these types of issues. I couldn't have asked for a better leader and better colleague. And finally, the Fed is very much, as we said earlier, a place that's driven by technical expertise. And I spent many hours learning as much of the detail of the Fed's operations as I could. came to play in 9/11, came to play in other ways as well. And so from my standpoint, while I was historic in being the first first African-American vice chair, what the Fed really values is not what one looks like, it's what you can contribute based on technical expertise. And I've worked really hard to develop as much technical expertise across all the domains as I possibly could. And that was ultimately rewarded on 9/11 when that expertise came into play.
I believe with the stepping down of the CEO of Tapestry, you were one of only 3 Fortune 500 African-American CEOs. Why is this so hard, Roger, to have Black people in leadership roles in this country?
I think the answer to the question has everything to do with pipeline. Getting to be the CEO of a Fortune 100 company is obviously, the exception for sure. The pyramid gets narrower and narrower and narrower. In order to have diversity, at the top ranks, one needs to have diversity at the bottom levels, and then you need to nurture that all along the way, not in the form of affirmative action in a negative sense, but in the form of appropriate mentoring and counseling and coaching and giving people opportunities. And that has not always been the case in American business. Again, I'm proud of our company. We were the first one to have an African-American, corporate officer in a major insurance company. That was in the 1950s. My great predecessor, Cliff Wharton, was the first African-American CEO of a Fortune 100 company when he was the CEO here in the 1980s. And so we've got a long history of trying to develop and promote people along. But having said that, we also cannot be complacent. And so we've put in place a training program called Journey to Inclusion that helps to remind all of our leaders that we're on a journey to inclusion. And that is one of the many tools that we are trying to use to keep our strong leadership role in diversity, inclusion, and equity by being very intentful about it. And the final point I'd make, I mentioned it earlier, our board is very diverse. And believe me when I tell you that our board takes a look at the diversity numbers on our HR committee. They want to know, how we're doing at all tiers in terms of maintaining a broadly diverse population. And so you need that kind of pressure from the board to make sure the company is paying attention. And that helps you to build the kind of culture that we continue to strive to build and maintain here of diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Roger Ferguson, CEO of TIAA, a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
This is Influencers. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll see you next time.